What if you were the first? The very first band of your kind to kick down the doors and prove that your style of music could be a force to be reckoned with. You'd think that would make you legends forever. But for one all-female band, being pioneers wasn't enough to keep them in the spotlight. Their story and the stories of 19 other metal bands who blazed brightly for a moment are a lesson in how cruel the music business can be. 1. Grim Reaper. When you decide to name your band Grim Reaper, you are making a promise. You are telling the world that your music is going to be dark, heavy, and maybe a little bit scary. And believe me, this band from England delivered on that promise. Their most famous song from back in 1983 was called See You in Hell. It was pure, simple, and powerful heavy metal. The whole thing was led by their singer, Steve Grimmett, a man whose voice was like an air raid siren, wailing and screaming with incredible power. The guitar riffs were simple but menacing, and the whole song just made you want to bang your head. The music video for the song was a classic for its time. It was made on a shoestring budget and showed the band rocking out in an old church, complete with spooky smoke machines and dramatic lighting. It was the perfect visual for their sound. The song was so good that it actually managed to get on the rock radio charts in America. That was a big deal for a British band that was this heavy. But here's the kicker. While hardcore metal fans loved them, their sound was just too raw and gritty for the mainstream. At the time, TV was being taken over by slicker, more polished bands with big hair and colorful clothes. Grim Reaper was the opposite of that. They were dark and noisy. To make matters worse, they had a lot of problems with their record company. These business issues made it really hard for them to release new music and tour properly. They were stuck. By the late 1980s, the band just fizzled out. They left behind one perfect heavy metal anthem, a true calling card for a band that was too real for the pop world. Grim Reaper was too raw for the mainstream. But our next band had the opposite problem. They had a tough guy image and a powerful sound, but they got squeezed out by two other styles of music that exploded at the same time. 2. Armored Saint. Long before the super-fast thrash metal scene took over California, the city of Los Angeles had a different kind of metal. It was tougher, grittier, and more down-to-earth. And the kings of that scene were a band called Armored Saint. They were fronted by a singer named John Bush, who had a powerful, commanding voice that sounded like he was leading an army into battle. Their song, Can You Deliver, from 1984, was a perfect example of their sound. It was a challenge thrown down to the listener, a heavy metal anthem for the working man. The song was a powerhouse, and it got a lot of airplay on rock radio stations. It seemed like Armored Saint was on the verge of becoming huge. They had the look, the sound, and an incredible live show. But they had some seriously bad timing. Just as they were starting to get popular, two other music scenes exploded around them. One was the super fast and aggressive thrash metal from the Bay Area. The other was the super flashy and popular glam metal from their own backyard on the Sunset Strip. Armored Saint was caught in the middle. They weren't quite as fast as the thrash bands, and they weren't as flashy as the glam bands. They were just tough, honest heavy metal. Sadly, that meant they got overlooked. They never had another song that did as well as Can You Deliver? Their singer, John Bush, would later become famous as the lead singer for the thrash metal band Anthrax. But Armored Saint, his first band, remained a beloved legend of the underground, a band that could have been massive if things had gone just a little bit differently. Armored Saint was a band with a tough sound, but our next band was all about having fun, and their one big hit was a simple chant that became a stadium rock classic. Helix. Gimme an R. O-C-K. It was a simple spell, but it was powerful. With that one chant, a Canadian band named Helix created one of the most fun and catchy rock anthems of the entire 1980s. Their song, called Rock You, was a blast of pure, simple energy. It was not complicated music. It was loud, it was straightforward, and it was made to be screamed along to by thousands of people in a giant arena. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. The song became a huge hit on rock radio in the United States back in 1984. The video was all over TV. The band, with their high energy and simple message of rocking out, was a perfect fit for the time. They were all about having a good time. But that simple, fun style was also their biggest weakness. As the 80s went on, heavy metal started to change. Bands became more theatrical, with bigger stage shows and more complex music. Other bands became more aggressive and faster. Helix, with their straightforward meat-and-potato style of rock, started to seem a little old-fashioned. They were still huge stars in their home country of Canada, where they are still considered rock and roll royalty to this day. But in America, their fame was like a flashbulb. It was brilliant for a moment with Rock You, and then it was gone. Helix was all about simple, straightforward rock. Our next band was the total opposite, a group of musical wizards whose sound was so technical and complex that it may have been too smart for the radio. 4. Vicious Rumors. The San Francisco Bay Area in the 1980s was world famous for one thing: thrash metal. It was the home of fast, aggressive bands that changed the face of music. But right in the middle of all that, there was a band called Vicious Rumors that was doing something a little different. They took the power and speed of American power metal and blended it with the aggression of thrash. The result was a sound that was both incredibly powerful and amazingly technical. In 1988, they released a song called Don't Wait For Me. It was the perfect blend of their styles. It had a melody that was catchy enough for rock radio, but it was also packed with lightning-fast guitar solos and a pounding rhythm that pleased the hardcore metal fans. The song was a minor hit, getting played on the radio and showing the world what this band could do. The problem was, their music was maybe a little too impressive. The band was made up of incredible musicians who could play their instruments at a mind-boggling level. Their songs were often long and complex, with lots of changes in tempo and mood. While this made them a favorite among other musicians and serious metal fans, it was a bit too much for the average listener. They were too heavy and complicated for mainstream success. They continued to be a respected and powerful force in the underground metal world for decades, but they never again came close to having a hit on the charts. Vicious Rumors was a band that was maybe too skilled for their own good. Our next band also had a ton of talent, but they wrapped it in a spooky horror movie package that was just too weird for the mainstream. 5. Lizzie Borden. In the 1980s, rock and roll was all about putting on a show, and few bands put on a show as wild as Lizzie Borden. The band was named after the famous historical figure, and their lead singer also took that name for himself. Their whole act was based on horror movies and spooky theatrics. They used fake blood, axes, and all sorts of crazy props on stage. It was a shocking and exciting spectacle. In 1987, they released a song called Me Against the World. It was the perfect anthem for their defiant, rebellious image. It was a powerful song about standing up for yourself, and it had a chorus that was perfect for rock radio. The song became a hit, and for a moment, it seemed like Lizzie Borden was going to be the next big thing in shock rock. But truth be told, their act was just too intense for most people. The horror movie gimmick that got them noticed also limited their appeal. Radio stations were a little nervous about playing a band that was so over the top. While fans of heavy metal loved their energy and their wild stage show, parents and TV networks were not as enthusiastic. They quickly vanished from the charts, becoming a true cult band. They were a group that was too shocking and too strange to be anything other than an underground legend. Lizzie Borden's spooky American horror show was too much for the charts. Our next band came from across the ocean in Germany, and their one big hit, was a perfect anthem that brought European metal to American shores, if only for a moment. 6. Warlock. Before she was known all over the world as the undisputed queen of metal, a German singer named Doro Pesch was the leader of a band called Warlock, and Warlock was a force of nature. Their song, All We Are, from 1987, is one of the greatest European metal anthems of all time. It's a song made for festivals with a powerful, fist-in-the-air chorus that everyone can sing along to. Doro's voice was full of passion and power, and she immediately stood out as a major star. The song was so good that it crossed the Atlantic Ocean and became a hit on rock radio in the United States. It was a huge moment, introducing a lot of Americans to the powerful, melodic style of traditional German heavy metal. It seemed like Warlock was poised for an American invasion, but for some reason, their sound never fully caught on in the US. Maybe it was a little too European for American tastes at the time. Then, the band ran into serious legal problems over the rights to their own name. It was a messy business situation that forced the band to break up. Doro Pesch wisely decided to continue her career as a solo artist, and she became a huge star all over the world. But the band Warlock, the group that introduced her to America, had their one shining moment with All We Are, and then disappeared from the US charts forever. Warlock brought German power to America for one song. Our next band was from England, and they were known for being so wild and energetic on stage that they had to invent a new name for their style of music. 7. Raven. Let's go back to the early 80s and the new wave of British heavy metal. This movement gave us some of the biggest metal bands of all time. And then there was Raven. This band from Newcastle, England, was different. They were so wild, so fast, and so energetic that they didn't think heavy metal was a good enough description for what they did. So they called their music athletic rock. And if you ever saw them play live, you would understand why. The three members of the band would run and jump all over the stage like crazy, all while playing incredibly fast and complex music. Their 1985 song, On and On, was a perfect snapshot of this chaotic energy. It was a blur of breakneck guitar riffs, a frantic bass line, and high-pitched vocals. The song was just polished enough that it managed to get some airplay on American rock radio. But let's be honest, this music was way too intense for most people. It was pure, unfiltered adrenaline. Raven ended up being a huge influence on the next generation of metal bands. The young musicians who were forming thrash metal bands like Metallica and Slayer looked up to Raven and were inspired by their speed and energy. But the band themselves were just too raw and too wild to stay in the mainstream spotlight. They were the pioneers who showed everyone else the way, but they were too far ahead of their time to reap the rewards. Raven was too fast for the world, but our next band was the opposite. They were all about slow, dramatic build-ups and epic stories, taking inspiration from the world of classical music. Savatage. From the sunny state of Florida came a band that always thought on a grander scale. The band was called Savatage, and they were not content to just write simple rock songs. They wanted to create epic musical journeys. They mixed the power of heavy metal with the drama and complexity of classical music and opera. Their songs were often long, theatrical stories. In 1987, they had a moment of pure genius. They took a very famous piece of classical music called In the Hall of the Mountain King by a composer named Edvard Grieg, and they turned it into a heavy metal masterpiece, and the song, which they called Hall of the Mountain King, was incredible. It kept the spooky, dramatic feeling of the original piece, but added heavy, powerful guitar riffs and a mind-blowing solo from their guitarist, the late, great Chris Oleva. The song was so unique and powerful that it became a hit on rock radio. It was unlike anything else being played at the time, but it was a double-edged sword. The very thing that made the song a hit, its ambition and complexity, was what kept the band from having another one. Their music was just too deep and too involved for the simple format of radio. Years later, the members of Savatage would go on to form the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, which became one of the most successful musical acts in the world. But back when they were Savatage, their one taste of mainstream chart success was this one epic classical metal creation. Savatage turned a classical piece into a metal hit. Our next band also had their one big hit with a song that was different from the rest of their music, a dark and haunting ballad that came from the rainy city of Seattle. 9. Metal Church. Long before the city of Seattle, Washington became famous for grunge music, it had a thriving and powerful heavy metal scene. And one of the most important bands from that scene was Metal Church. As their name suggests, their music was a religion for them. They played a dark, powerful, and aggressive style of metal that was infused with the speed of thrash. Most of their songs were fast and heavy. That's why it was so surprising when their biggest hit, from 1986, was a power ballad. But this was not a typical happy love song. The song was called "Watch the Children Pray," and it was a dark, somber, and chilling piece of music. The song had a haunting melody and the raw, emotional vocals of their singer, David Wayne. It created a spooky atmosphere that really stood out on rock radio. It was a powerful and completely unexpected hit. But it was a one-time thing. The rest of Metal Church's music was way too heavy and aggressive for the mainstream. They were, and still are, revered by metal fans as true pioneers of the Seattle metal scene. But their one brief moment on the national charts was with this one dark, unforgettable ballad. Metal Church gave us a haunting ballad. Our next band gave us a song that was a simple, powerful love letter to heavy metal itself, created by a group of lovable underdogs from Canada. 10. Anvil. The story of the Canadian band Anvil is one of the most heartwarming in all of rock and roll. It is a story about never giving up on your dream, no matter what. These guys have been hammering out pure, honest, old-school heavy metal since the late 1970s. Their most famous song from 1982 is called "Metal on Metal," and the song is exactly what the title says it is. It is a simple, powerful, and totally sincere tribute to the genre of music that they love. With its chugging, powerful guitar riff and a chorus that was made to be shouted by a crowd of headbangers, the song became an anthem for metal fans in the underground. It was so good that it even managed to get some airplay on rock radio stations. But the band's gritty, no-frills style never really broke through to the big time. They were always a little too goofy and a little too real for the polished world of pop music. For decades, they kept playing, even when only a few people were listening. Then, in 2008, a documentary movie was made about them called Anvil, The Story of Anvil. The movie was a huge hit, and it told their funny and touching story to the whole world. It finally gave them the fame and recognition they had deserved for so long. But their time as a band with a song on the charts ended way back in 1982 with this one perfect tribute to metal. Anvil's love for metal gave them one hit. Our next band was also from Canada, and they were all about one thing: pure, blistering speed. 11. Exciter. When people talk about the fastest bands in the early days of metal, the Canadian band Exciter has to be in the conversation. They were one of the very first bands to play what would become known as speed metal. And their 1983 song, Heavy Metal Maniac, was a mission statement. The song was a frantic, blistering assault on the senses. It featured raw-throated screams from their singing drummer, Dan Beehler, and guitar riffs that were played at a ridiculously high speed. It was pure musical adrenaline. The track was so wild and so ahead of its time that it actually got some notice from rock radio stations that were looking for something new and heavier. But you have to understand, this music was way too extreme for the average person in 1983. It was like listening to a jet engine taking off. Exciter ended up being a massive influence on the bands that came after them. The musicians who started the thrash metal scene were all listening to Exciter and trying to play as fast as they could. But the band itself was just too far ahead of the curve. They were too fast, too loud, and too raw to find any real mainstream success. They remain a true one-hit wonder of the metal underground, a band that lit the fuse for an explosion but didn't stick around for the party. Exciter was all about speed. Our next band had a more classic, swashbuckling style, and their one hit was a fun anthem about two of rock and roll's favorite things. 12. Riot. From the tough streets of New York City came a band called Riot. This was a band that could do a little bit of everything. They mixed the classic bluesy sound of hard rock with the epic melodic style of European power metal. And for some reason, their mascot was a strange-looking baby seal creature named Johnny. It was a weird mix, but it worked. Their one big hit came in 1981 with a song called Swords and Tequila. It was a perfect slice of their fun, high-energy style. It was a swashbuckling rock song with a killer guitar riff and a chorus that was just made for singing along to at a party. The song became a staple on rock radio and remains their only song to ever hit the U.S. charts. The band's biggest problem was that they could never keep a steady lineup. Their singers and other members changed constantly over the years. This made it really hard for them to build a consistent following. Their sound was always changing a little bit with each new member. They are still considered cult heroes by die-hard metal fans, but their one and only victory on the American charts was this one fun-filled battle cry. Riot's one hit was a party anthem. Our next band was from the same era, but they got lost in the crowd of one of the most important movements in metal history. 13. Tigers of Pan Tang. The new wave of British heavy metal in the early 1980s was an incredibly exciting time. There were dozens of amazing new bands coming out of England, all playing a new, faster, and more energetic style of metal. And right in the middle of this creative explosion was a band with a very cool name, Tigers of Pan Tang. Their 1981 song, Hellbound, was a perfect example of the NWOBHM sound. It was a galloping, fast-paced rocker with twin guitar harmonies and a powerful, melodic vocal. The song had all the right ingredients, and it was good enough to get some attention from rock radio stations in America. For a moment, it seemed like they might be one of the bands to break out from the pack. But they were hit with a classic rock and roll problem: lineup changes. The band went through several different singers in a very short period of time. Every time they seemed to be gaining some momentum, they would have to stop and find a new frontman. In a scene that was already incredibly crowded with talented bands, these kinds of problems were a death sentence. They just got lost in the shuffle. They were a great band with a killer song, but they couldn't overcome their internal issues to build on their one small success. The Tigers of Pan Tang got lost in the British metal explosion. Our next band was one of the biggest from that same scene, but their story in America is very, very different from their story in the rest of the world. 14. Saxon. This is one of the strangest stories in heavy metal. If you go to Europe, the band Saxon are gods. They are absolute legends who can headline giant music festivals and play to tens of thousands of people. But if you ask the average rock fan in the United States about them, they will probably only know one song. These pioneers of the new wave of British heavy metal are, in America, a one-hit wonder. That one hit was their 1980 classic, Wheels of Steel. It is a gritty, working-class heavy metal anthem about the freedom of the open road and the love of motorcycles. The song has a powerful, driving beat and the unmistakable voice of their singer, Biff Byford. It was a perfect rock song, and it became a hit on American radio. But for some strange reason, that's where their American success stopped. They had dozens of other amazing songs like Denim and Leather, Princess of the Night, and 747, Strangers in the Night, that were huge hits all over the world. But none of them ever made it onto the US charts. It's a true mystery. They remain one of the biggest and most successful metal bands of all time, but in the United States, they are defined by this one single glorious ride. Saxon are legends everywhere but America. Our next band is legendary for a different reason. They wrote a song that was so good, another band copied it and became the biggest metal band in the world. 15. Diamond Head. This might be the most important one-hit wonder in heavy metal history. You might not know the name Diamond Head, but you have definitely heard their music. That's because a little band called Metallica loved them so much that they covered their songs over and over again. But this British band from the NWO BHM had a brief moment of their own. Their song from 1980 is an epic masterpiece called Am I Evil? It is one of the most influential metal songs ever written. The song starts with a spooky, classical-inspired intro before kicking into one of the most iconic and evil-sounding guitar riffs of all time. The song's long, complex structure and dark themes basically laid out the blueprint for what would become thrash metal. The original version by Diamond Head was so powerful that it managed to get a little bit of airplay on American radio. But the band's sound was very raw, and they didn't have the support of a big record label. They stayed a small underground band. A few years later, Metallica would record their own, more polished version of the song and introduce it to millions of fans. Diamond Head's influence is absolutely massive, but their own story on the mainstream charts begins and ends with this one legendary evil question. Diamond Head wrote the blueprint for thrash. Our next band also came from that same British scene, and their one hit was a perfect slice of spooky, occult-inspired rock. 16. Angel Witch. In the early days of the new wave of British heavy metal, there was a band that mixed the dark, doomy sound of Black Sabbath with the new, faster style of playing. That band was Angel Witch, and their sound was a unique and spooky brew. Their self-titled song from 1980 is a true cult classic of the genre. The song Angel Witch kicks off with one of the catchiest and most memorable guitar riffs of the entire era. It's both heavy and melodic at the same time. The lyrics were all about dark magic and spooky themes, which was a very popular topic for metal bands at the time. The song was just so good that it managed to get a little bit of notice from rock radio stations in the United States. However, the band's career was very unstable. They broke up and got back together several times, and their sound was probably a little too niche for widespread appeal. They couldn't build on the small success of their one great song. They remain a beloved favorite among hardcore metal fans who appreciate their unique blend of heavy and spooky, a perfect example of a band with one flawless, magical song. Angel Witch was a band of spooky dudes. Our next band proved that you didn't have to be a guy to rock just as hard, if not harder. 17. Girlschool. The world of heavy metal in the late 70s and early 80s was almost completely dominated by men, but a band from England called Girlschool was about to change that. This quartet of talented women kicked down the door and proved that they could play rock and roll that was just as loud, raw, and aggressive as any of their male counterparts. They played a punky, high-energy style of metal that was completely unapologetic. They were so good that they caught the attention of the legendary Lemmy Kilmister from Motorhead, who became one of their biggest champions. Their 1981 song, Hit and Run, was a perfect example of their sound. It was a snarling, fast-paced banger of a song, full of attitude and energy. The track clicked with rock radio and became a hit. Girlschool toured with some of the biggest bands in the world, like Deep Purple and Rainbow. But their raw, abrasive edge might have limited their appeal to a wider audience in the United States. They were a little too tough for the pop charts. They remain true pioneers, a band that broke down barriers and had one killer hit in the U.S. to prove it. Girls' School was a band of pioneers. Our next band is the total opposite, a group so obscure and so mysterious that they are like a ghost in the history of heavy metal. 18. Grimalkin. Some one-hit wonders are famous for being forgotten. And then there are bands that are so forgotten they become a mystery. That is the story of an American band called Grimalkin. This band seemed to appear out of thin air in 1985, and they disappeared just as quickly. They released a song called Black Mass, which was a heavy, doomy, and riff-driven piece of metal. The lyrics were all about dark, occult subjects, which was common for the time. Somehow, this song from this completely unknown band was just catchy enough that it got picked up by a few rock radio stations. It had a brief, flickering moment on the charts, but the band had no promotion, no music video, and no tour. They were a complete enigma. After releasing one album, the band vanished into thin air. No one really knows what happened to them. They are a true metal mystery, a ghost of a band that left behind one spooky, phantom hit.